Okay, let's get started. After a little more logistics and recapitulations, what I want to talk about this lecture is accounting for the fact that the world is right now so divergent in its relative levels of economic development. I don't think we know all the answers. I don't think I'll provide a satisfactory lecture. But why it is that our world today is so small in the sense of transportation and communications, and yet is so divergent in terms of its extremes of wealth and poverty, is extremely important and I think extremely interesting. After all, to get, say, from... What's the furthest large city in the world from here? I think it's probably Perth. To get from San Francisco to Perth, Australia, takes less time and costs less as a share of average people's incomes than it took to get from London to Edinburgh, from the capital of England to the capital of Scotland back in 1800. Right? That is one small island in northwest Europe was larger in terms of transportation and communications that our entire world is today. And yet, if you looked across the regions of Great Britain in 1800, you saw they were pretty much all more or less the same. Some were a little bit richer than others, some poorer. Home counties of England were maybe 40% richer than average. Northern wastes of Scotland were maybe 40% poorer than average. But nothing like the extraordinary differences in living standards and productivity levels across regions that we see in our world today. That's the problem we're going to be gnawing at for most of this lecture. But first, logistics. Last I looked, we had 9 available seats and 9 people left on the waiting list, which means there's something hanging up your registration if you're on the waiting list. It's probably that you're trying to get into a section that is already full. But if it's something else, you need to go see Joan Cask at the International and Area Studies Office. She controls adding people to the class at this late date. But first of all, let's see how many of you there are who are still on the wait list and still want to get into this class. How many people are we talking about? And so, okay, 2 drops and 3 on the wait list. You get you to Joan Cask. The wait list is cleared. We don't have a capacity problem in this class this spring, and that's good. Now, there also was a request that I redo the additional office hours head-to-head competition with just the 2 times that were most popular, Tuesday after lecture and Thursday after lecture, in order in the hope or in the expectation or in the belief or in the fear that people's preferences for additional office hours in addition to Wednesday afternoon would be different if they were just given the 2 most popular times, rather than if there were a bunch of others added to it as well. So what do people think? When do people want to have the additional office hours? Okay, Tuesday p.m. has a big significant plus. So there'll be Tuesday p.m. after lecture. I can't do it today because I've been dragged into the process of seeing whether or not the university wants to promote an assistant history professor to tenure, and so have to go running off to various meetings and read additional things. But starting next Tuesday, I'm going to go straight from lecture over to the Free Speech Movement Cafe patio and hang out there until everybody's questions are answered. And hopefully that will get more people coming to office hours in this course. In a way, it's odd that I'm doing this for the history department. That is, if I were the chancellor, I would say, look, Berkeley's finances have taken a huge hit over the past 3 years. relative to our private university competitors. And also, we've been disappointed in the legislatures. The legislature has proven to be a lot less willing to continue to perform the function for Berkeley that the endowments perform for the private universities than we had thought it was, or indeed than the legislature had promised that it was. And so we're going to have a hard time attracting assistant professors in the next 10 or 15 years or so, the way we have over the past 10 or 15 years. That is, usually in the past, if someone has a choice between an assistant professorship at Berkeley and an assistant professorship at, say, Duke, they'll choose Berkeley. That's probably not going to be true over the next 10 years or so because Berkeley's long-run finances are shaky. In that case, we should be simply taking the assistant professors we got and promoting them as fast as possible because we're unlikely to be able to replace them with people who are as smart and as energetic and as creative, quite, as we currently have. So why not promote them and make them feel grateful to us? Maybe then they'll stay and they'll stick around and feel loyal when places like Duke or Northwestern or Yale come knocking and ask them to move. We're not doing that, and I don't understand why not. It's somewhat disturbing, but that's going to churn up my afternoon today. Also logistics, problem set 2 is due at the start of lecture Thursday. I'm in a big pile right up here at the front. Seems to be best. Problem set 3 will go out tomorrow, due on Thursday, February 10th at the beginning of the lecture. We're now working toward an early March first midterm exam. I'm not sure of the exact day yet because it depends on how quickly I get to go through the next bunch of the syllabus. So far, I'm pretty close to being on track, but that may change. Problem set 3 will be on mixed growth and depression economics. The stuff we've been talking about long-run growth since the beginning of the class. And then the next unit, the unit on why is it that we sometimes have periods of high unemployment like now, and how long are those periods likely to last? Last preliminary, these recapitulations. Things you really should know if you take this course. Things I want drilled into your skull so that 5 years from now, if you're awakened from a sound sleep with a particular question, you'll be able to grab the right answer out of your brains. The first one was one that you all have nailed. That is, how much bigger is total world GDP now than it was 10,000 years ago? It's about 17,000 times bigger. Human populations are about 1,000, 1,200 times bigger than they were 10,000 years ago. And as a species, we're about 14 times as rich, to the extent you can make such calculations. That's a lot of economic growth, although it's over a long time. Most of it takes place at a relatively small pace. The thing I want you to have drilled into your skulls that we didn't all get right last time was what's the current unemployment rate? What fraction of the labor force, that is, the people who have jobs and who say they're looking for jobs, do we have saying that they can't find a job, or at least can't find a job they would take? Yes, we're there. We have 97% giving the right seasonally adjusted answer, 9.4%, and the remaining 3% giving the seasonally unadjusted answer, 9.1%. If we don't specify, we want seasonally adjusted numbers, but that's good. Third, the question that belongs with the next unit. Back in 1803, Jean-Baptiste Say claimed that if there's deficient demand for some goods and services, there's excess demand for others. And so it's nonsensical to say that an economy is short of demand. This was something that confused economists for the first 30 years of the 19th century or so, from 1803 on up to 1829, I think. And alas, it still confuses people today. But we're nailing it. 98% getting the right answer B, because people spend their incomes not just on currently produced goods and services, but on financial assets. Answer A, Answer A explains why it is that a shortage of demand produces high unemployment, or one of the reasons why shortages of demand produce high unemployment. Because firms would rather fire people than cut everybody's wages. You cut everybody's wages, and it turns out that everybody feels dissed, substantially dissed. If they were being paid $12 an hour last year, but they're only paying you $10 an hour this year, you're not sure whether they did this because they had to or whether they just think they might be able to squeeze a little more work out of you for less money. You're unhappy. You're not going to work too hard. You're going to slack off. Much better, almost every business in the world thinks, if you have to cut your wage bill, to cut it by firing a few people. Because then the people who are pissed are gone, and they aren't around to work badly. And the people who are still there are, A, they may be grateful for the fact that you kept them, and B, they may be scared that they're going to be next. So for worker morale, worker discipline, whatever issues, we see that wages are sticky downward, that businesses are very lax to cut wages, would rather fire workers instead, and that's why the number of firings in the economy went way, way up when demand fell off in 2008. Answer C is an explanation for B. There was a financial panic, and it disrupted the web of credit. And so as a result, a whole bunch of businesses and a whole bunch of people said, wait a minute, we need to have more financial assets so we'll be able to make payments and fulfill our contracts if something else goes wrong. Answer D might be an explanation for some recessions we had in the 1970s when the world oil price tripled, and it might be the answer to an economic downturn that happens at some point in the future. It's not for today. And I forgot to put a letter E in front of the last. Overinvestment rendering important parts of the capital stock valueless. That certainly happened. We built way too many houses over the past 10 years in the desert between Los Angeles and Albuquerque for anyone to want to live in them. Most of people who thought they'd be occupying those houses 4 or 5 years ago would rather have been living in 2 or 3 bedroom walk-ups in Venice Beach rather than God knows where, somewhere way beyond San Bernardino. But just because we've made a mistake and invested too much or in the wrong kind of capital doesn't mean the response ought to be or should be or must be high unemployment. We way over-invested in telecommunications in 1999 and 2000. The fallout from that didn't push the unemployment rate up to 10%. So I want answer B and not C, D, or the thing that has no label that should be E. And last, what's the single equation you should use most often to analyze problems about long-run economic growth, at least in this course, and in follow-on courses that rely on this kind of growth model framework? This savings and investment and technology and population growth and efficiency of technology, efficiency of labor framework. And we're nailing this again. Yes, the first equation is the right one. For the second one, I flipped the numerator and the denominator in the initial fraction denoting the capital intensity of the economy. For the third one, I've put the wrong little symbol up in the exponent. Equations D and E are absolutely fine equations, but generally you're usually going to want to be using A. Because A gets at the fundamental determinants a little deeper than D or E do. And no, we already asked this. Let's skip this. But here's the last thing that I want nailed into your brain. Your ability to do these kinds of growth calculations. So how fast did real GDP per capita in Botswana grow between 1960 and 2010? How do I expect you to do this calculation? Okay, and we're all the way up to 121. Okay, C, that's right. C is the answer I'm looking for. We don't yet have this nailed. The way to do this quickly in your head is to say that from 900 per year to 15,000 per year, that's much closer to multiplication by a factor of 16 than it is to multiplication by 8 or by 32. A factor of 8 is 3 doublings. A factor of 32 is 5 doublings. Multiplication by a factor of 16 is 4 doublings. 4 doublings over 50 years means 1 doubling is accomplished about every 12 years. And then you should use the rule of 72 to divide 72 by 12 and say that if something doubles in 12 years, it's growing at 6% per year. And that will give you 5.6% as the answer we are looking for. And last question. How far are you all coming from? It would be really nice to be able to start this lecture at 10 after on the spot, or even 8 after. And I had hopes of being able to do this because we're down here in the more or less in the center of campus now, as opposed to way up in the engineering school or up in the business school or someplace else up where the air is thin because the altitude is high. And yet that doesn't seem to be what's happening. So where are people coming from? Ooh, yeah. Okay, so I think we're going to have to start between 12 and 15 because we got too many people coming from far, far away. The campus is just a little bit too spread out. I'll recommend to the chancellor that he builds some more big honking 10-story buildings with classrooms in them rather than the 4- and 5-story buildings that seem to be the rule around here. That's too bad, but that's life, that's necessity. So with those preliminaries out of the way, we finally get to the meat of the lecture. Why is the world today so divergent? And, the world wasn't always so divergent. Even 2 centuries ago, the world was much, much closer together if you looked across regions in terms of productivity levels and living standards than it is today. Come April, we're going to be bringing Professor Ken Pomeranz up from the University of California at Irvine, he being one of the world's experts on Chinese economic history and Chinese economic growth. And one thing he's likely to talk about is about how the general belief you find in America and in Northwest Europe that Western Europe, at least, has been richer than Asia for a very long time. Now that simply isn't true, and how the dividing line isn't 1,000 or 1,500, but that even in 1,800, there is very, very little to choose from in average people's living standards between, say, the home counties of England, the lower Thames Valley, the richest part of England, and the richest parts of China, the lower Yangtze Valley. England has an edge in precision machinery and the ability to get cheap coal to burn in your fireplaces to keep warm, but down in the Yangtze Delta, you really don't need to burn much coal in your fireplaces to keep warm. They don't have much precision machinery. They have much better textiles, significantly better paintings, and probably a more nourishing diet than England, because the English diet appears to take a big dive downward sometime in the 18th century. And if you look at England in 1800 versus the Stone Age, you see that standards of living in England in 1800 there have little, if anything, above the Stone Age. So what that tells us is that countries couldn't have been much poorer than they ever were before 1800 ever. That you couldn't have had the kinds of economic growth we've been having since 1800 and 1870, that it has to have started around 1800. Because if it had started earlier, it means people in 1700 would have been significantly poorer than people in 1800, and then all the people in 1700 would have starved to death. Significantly less than 2,300 calories a day for a population doing agricultural labor simply won't cut it. People simply won't survive to reproduce. So that back before 1800, it looks as though the world as a whole was pretty much as poor as it could be. That people were very close to what Thomas Robert Malthus would call biological subsistence. And the world was pretty equal as well. Yeah. Maybe a spread of 4 or 5 to 1 at most between the richest and the poorest regions in the world economy. Pick 2 countries or 2 regions more or less at random, and the odds are overwhelmingly that the poor one will be at least half as well off as the rich one in terms of the average standard of living of its people. Differences across countries, especially if you take Great Britain and the Netherlands. Great Britain and the Netherlands being these 2 points way out here. The most commercial societies and the most energy-intensive societies the world back then had ever seen, with the United States bringing up the rear, in large part because of its extraordinary amount of arable land per capita. You see, when the Europeans hit the beaches of the Americas starting in 1492, they brought with them an incredible array of diseases that had been developed in Eurasia over the previous 10,000 years, since the Amerindian population had immigrated over the Bering Strait. And so by the time European settlement started on a significant scale in North America, Amerindian populations were down by 80%, 90% relative to their previous peaks. Which is why most of the narrative of the United States is of expansion into a largely unoccupied wilderness. But the wilderness had not long been unoccupied. It was simply this disease-born demographic catastrophe that had created the United States, in which people had immense farms by European standards and were thus relatively wealthy. But, the world in 1800, nevertheless, was pretty equal, even though it was very large. Right? 6 months to go from Britain to India in 1800, which made the British conquest of India a kind of unusual thing, because the people in London were always giving orders that were at least a year out of date by the time they got back to India. Our world today is much more unequal, in spite of the fact that it has shrunk enormously in transportation and communications. But before we get to that, we should first deal with the question of why in the world of 1800 was it so equal? And how do we know that modern economic growth could not have been going on long before 1800? What makes us confident with our declaration that our current era, in which each generation is highly likely to see increasing technology and increasing living standards, has not been going on for very long in historical perspective? Why do we know that back before 1800, the idea that people should live better than their parents was a weird and unusual idea, rather than what it is today, a commonplace? And we're spread out all over the place. I favor D, possibly not with intelligent raccoons. But at any event, D is, I think, the right answer. We know this because we have a pretty good read on what standards of living were in 1800, and if they had grown at anything like the doubling every 50 years of the 19th century, or the doubling of standards of living every 30 years of the 20th century. People, even back in 1700, would have overwhelmingly have been dead of starvation. The other answers. Well, C is the economist's traditional explanation of why there was no modern economic growth back before 1800. That you didn't have modern governments and modern markets up and running in such a way that people thought that they could turn their attention to figuring out how to make whatever they were making more cheaply and on a larger scale. Instead, once people got somewhat rich, they began to think, how am I going to be able to keep what I have against someone from the government coming and grabbing it from me? Answer B. Answer B is the answer you tend to get if you go to the engineering school. Right? Well, of course, you can't get rich until you can make really cool machines. And it was key developments in metalworking in the late 18th century, in the late 1700s, that created the space for the Industrial Revolution and for modern economic growth. Oxford economic historian Robert Allen has a very nice book about how all this came together. How the fact that England had cut down all its trees and so had to rely on coal for energy, and how agricultural productivity was fairly high, so wages were high and energy was abundant, as opposed to China, which at the time was about as rich, but where wages were low and energy was really expensive. How that gave England an edge in terms of giving its engineers an incentive to develop very good high-precision machinery so they could actually use coal and steam power to do stuff, and how then that took it off. We economists tend to be more social sciences and less engineers because we tend to go for C rather than for B. And A tends to be much more ecologists and demographers and others, who tend to say, well, of course, back when you only have 5 million people on the earth and none of them can read, well, of course, it's very hard to have the kind of scientific knowledge, scientific progress, and technological application in order to make for modern economic growth. Right? That back before the year 1500, it took 400 years for the idea of spaghetti to get from China to Italy, for example. When it takes 400 years for an invention like that to diffuse across Eurasia, as opposed to today, when someone gets on a plane with a blueprint and they were in Frankfurt in the morning, they're in Seoul in the afternoon or the following morning, as opposed to today. Of course you get a lot more progress today than you did in the past. After all, 2 heads are better than 1. Or as the computer scientists like to say, if you have enough eyeballs looking at them, all bugs are shallow. Right? All problems are easy to solve if you have enough independent minds trying to think of how to solve them. By contrast, when you don't have a lot of people and when they aren't literate and you can't write things down, it's very hard to have rapid technological progress. Since I'm an economist, I'm going to tend to slide to answer C when asked, how do we know that modern economic growth wasn't going on long before 1800? I have no reason to think that's correct. Surely if I were a demographer, I would think A, and surely if I were an engineer, I would think B. The answer to this particular question, however, is D. We know, because of the poverty of the world in 1800, that modern economic growth had not been going on for long. For why it hadn't been going on for long, those are the other possible answers. They're the answers to a slightly different question. Well, we can take a more quantitative, not just why was the world in 1800 so poor, why was the world in 1800 remarkably equal? And so let's assume that we have no progress in the efficiency of labor. That we know that back before 1800 we essentially had no technological progress, or rather whatever technological progress we had was offset by the fact that we had more people, that the population tended to grow slowly over time. And that after all, if in 1800 you have a much better kind of rice than you had in 900, but if your farm is only a third as large, even rice that's 3 times as good isn't going to get you ahead. So if you assume that there's no improvement in the efficiency of labor before 1800, and if you assume that technology is fairly well diffused across Eurasia at least, that there's nothing that's well known in one region that can't be found out in another. And if you're willing to assume that the capital share diminishing returns in our production function is not too large. That is, that increases in the amount of physical capital in investment don't produce very large increases in income. in large part because the level of technology is relatively low. And so adding more machines doesn't necessarily help you very much. You already have one plow and 2 oxen. Add another plow and 2 more oxen, what good does it do you? There's only one of you. You have to guide the plow. The oxen can't guide the plow by themselves. And you don't have numerically computer-controlled robots to guide the other oxen and plow with you. Maybe you can hook up your 4 oxen to your plow and cut a deeper furrow, but you're not going to do a great deal to increase your productivity with more capital. If we start with that, then I think we're going to be able to explain, or at least understand, why the world as a whole in 1800 is relatively equal. First implication is demography, that this is 1800. This is back before the widespread availability of artificial birth control. This is back in the days when your life expectancy was low. And so if you were an adult and if you wanted to buy some form of life insurance, the best way to do that was to have a bunch of kids. That after all, once the kids are 6, they can start weeding effectively in the garden, and that's a help. Once the kids are 8, they can start spinning and weaving effectively. That's a help. At a relatively young age, kids become a net addition to the productive resources of the households. They're, after all, they're kids. They don't eat very much, at least until they become teenagers. And if you're living in a pre-industrial society, the only form of life insurance that you can buy are people who'll be alive when you're old to help take care of you when you break your leg. Those are almost surely your children and your grandchildren. And as long as infant mortality is high and life expectancy is short, you've got to have a lot of kids to have a good chance of having surviving dependents when you hit 60, let alone when you hit 80. These tend to mean that a richer country is going to have a higher population growth rate because people are going to be having more kids and feeding them better if they're richer. Women are not going to be spending as many years with fat reserves sufficiently low that they don't ovulate. Children are not going to be spending so many years with their immune systems so impaired by deficiencies, by vitamin deficiencies, that they drop dead when the common cold comes around. Back in pre-industrial societies, a richer country would have a higher population growth rate. That means that even if other things would make you rich, say if you had a high savings rate, well, then you're going to have a higher population growth rate too, and that higher N, that's going to offset some of the benefits of higher savings. So you won't get that much richer from, say, being a thrifty society which saves more. And even if the S over N plus delta term is pretty big, well, as long as alpha is relatively small, as long as you haven't invented very many of the different kinds of productive capital goods we have, even big differences in capital intensity across economies aren't going to lead to very big differences in output and output per worker. But nevertheless, we have not just an equal world, we have a poor world, and we have an unequal world within economies. Why aren't there some societies that are stagnant but richer? Why is everybody relatively poor? And also, why is every society relatively unequal? Why does every society have an upper class and a king or an emperor or at least a group of guild masters who control things? Well, suppose that you had a relatively high standard of living back before 1800 because your society had a relatively low population density, because you had lots of resources per capita. What's likely to happen then? Well, 2 things could happen. First is because you have a relatively high standard of living, your people want to buy life insurance by having lots of children, and your population grows. And all of a sudden, your edge in terms of natural resources per capita is gone. Not tomorrow and not in 25 years, but over the next 200 years. Second, if you have a relatively high standard of living because you're sharing out your production fairly, well, they're the people over the next hill, and they're not sharing out their production fairly, which means that some of them are learning to ride horses while carrying spears and stick things from people from the horses, with the spears while they're on the horses. And when they come over the hill and they want your stuff, you aren't going to be able to resist very effectively. Unless, of course, you're the Mongols and the Huns and live out on the prairie all the time and everyone rides horses. But otherwise, unequal societies have an enormous advantage in terms of whenever a war starts. And so societies tend to become more and more unequal over time. That kind of produces the world we see in 1800, at least from this economic growth perspective. So now another reading or attention question. When was the world most unequal? And if you're puzzled because you haven't heard that in this lecture, I don't think you have. This is a throwaway remark from 2 lectures ago in order to figure out whether you've managed to retain this. Okay, we're up to 130, which is, well, okay. Answers today. Somewhat of a trick question. Actually, it was 1975. 1975 was when world income inequality peaked. It wasn't unequal in 10,000 BC, because back in 10,000 BC we were still pretty much all hunter-gatherers. It wasn't terribly unequal in 1800, because that was the end of the agrarian age, during which it was extremely difficult in order to attain any significant difference in living standards society across society. But in 1975, the level of global inequality was actually larger than it is today. And here's the picture of how the world's diverged between 1800 and today, with the United States being the kind of very odd color. I don't know what I'd call that color. It's certainly not California gold, which is what it's supposed to be. A kind of sickly greenish, the color that a Cal bear would paint if it was sick, slightly, feeling queasy. That's the United States up at the top. But Argentina, the other sickly gold, smaller snake trail behind it. Back in 1800, you ask, what's the difference between the United States and Argentina? And people say one's in the northern hemisphere, the other's in the southern hemisphere. They look very, very similar in terms of their natural resources and their climate. They look very, very similar in terms of their ability to attract migrants from Europe. Yet the United States now has income per capita above $40,000 per year. Argentina's stuck back at 10,000 or so, more in a good year, less in a bad. Japan. Japan's the end of the red snake, up at the top, fairly close to the United States, but with a significantly longer life expectancy. A life expectancy that's pretty much always been longer than the United States, except for when Curtis LeMay's B-29s were bombing Japan at the end of World War II, which means that something like 3% of people in Japan died I forget whether this is 1944 or 1945. And relatively few of those who died were soldiers. Then I also, for fun, put China itself up smack here. And the thing to notice about the large snake that's China is this is 1975. Right? And that's why the world was more unequal in 1975 than it's been since. Because China in 1975 was still no richer in living standards than it had been in 1800. And last, this has covered up the little blue snake, is Zimbabwe, which, well, no, which is richer than it was back in 1800, and which does have a longer life expectancy than it did have in 1800. So it's not the case that things haven't gotten any better in Zimbabwe over the past 210 years. But things have gotten much, much better in life expectancy, living standards, and productivity levels pretty much every place else, especially every place outside of Africa. Not so in Zimbabwe. Yeah? We fight over this, especially demographers. One view is it's overwhelmingly equalization. That is, China in 1800 is an unequal country of landlords and peasants. By China in 1975, well, you've shot many of the ex-landlords, and you've taken many of the children of ex-landlords, and you've sent them out to the countryside to gather eggs and learn from the workers and peasants. And so income is much more equally divided. And that will produce significant benefits in life expectancy if you no longer have extremes of rich and poor. The second thing is that we learned an awful lot about public health between 1750 and 1925. And we're able to apply that. When you figure out the importance of keeping your drinking water from getting contaminated by cholera, for example, that's an easy 5 years on life expectancy from reduced infant mortality right then and there. Similarly, a whole bunch of minor interventions that, even today, mothers with children who are suffering from incredible amount of diarrhea when they get dysentery. At some point, people will say, well, it doesn't do any good to keep giving them liquids. It's just all coming out the other end. And that's exactly wrong. If you have someone with dysentery, the only way to keep ahead of it is to make sure that you keep flooding them with liquids so that as much goes in as comes out, because that's how the disease spreads. Right? Its idea is it multiplies inside your body and then comes out in the liquid, and then it infects other people. The disease doesn't care if it kills you as long as it spreads itself far enough and fast enough. And so you can get ahead of dysentery and of other diseases simply by doing the appropriate simple home therapies. Fourth and last, increased income does matter, and does matter a bunch. Say you can see the break point between the ages in which it was overwhelmingly public health and the age in which our increases in life expectancy are driven in large parts by income, coming around 1900, when you've gotten the easy, low-hanging fruit in terms of public health. And then thereafter, there's a much closer relationship that's a much greater percentage of the increases in life expectancy come from increases in productivity. With recently some signs of a change, if only because the American lifestyle, at least, is sufficiently unhealthy in lots of ways as to make people think that possibly we've gone beyond the curve, and we at least may be at a stage where additional income is actually going to start reducing our life expectancy or putting downward pressure on it with medical technology working the other way. It's probably good to eat meat and get meat protein up to 4 times a week, but a Big Mac at every meal is not good at all. And so Divergence gave us the world as it is today, with income per capita levels spread out all the way from 50,000 all the way down to $400 per person per year. A spread of income that's 100-fold. And these are income measures that take account of the fact that it's more expensive to live in San Francisco than it is to live in Harare. Even taking account of the fact that rich countries have high price levels, these are supposedly the best estimates we have of real differences in standard of living across countries. There's just no comparison between the world of 1800 back here and the world of today in terms of how unequal things have gotten. And there is the consolation, right? The consolation is that we have had a bunch of convergence since 1975 or 1980, that you kind of try to do global statistics of inequality across people in the world. The numbers today are much lower than the numbers were back in 1975 or 1980. And I don't know whether it's fortunate or unfortunate that this convergence appears only if you count each person as one rather than if you count each country as one. That is, if you take a random person in a random country X, and then another random person in another random country Y, and say how big is the gap in relative terms between their incomes, you'll get the same answer today that you did back in 1975. That the universe of countries is no closer than it was back then. Yeah?
So you're looking at GDP income per capita in different countries.
Right.
Would you see the same sort of trajectory if you were to look within those countries?
Yeah, within country, inequality is just not a factor. That inequality across countries absolutely swamps inequality within countries, and has ever since about 1840 or so, in its contribution to the dispersion of the global distribution of income. Even a very rich person in China in 1980, in relative terms, was very poor by American standards. The convergence we see across people is solely because two big countries have done very well since 1980. Take China and India out of the sample, and the world today is actually more unequal, both on a per person, on a cross person, and on a cross country level than it was back in 1980. And you can say that, well, isn't it wonderful that the governments of China and India have actually been growth oriented since 1980? That's a magnificent thing for human well-being. On the other hand, if you want to be pessimistic, you can say, but wait a minute, that's just pure luck. There's no sign that governments as a whole have gotten any better at figuring out what to do to guarantee prosperity. And I don't know how much confidence you have in the ability of China and India to continue to have good economic growth promoting governance over the next 50 years. What they say in Singapore is that the Qing dynasty had 3 good emperors, starting with Kangxi and ending with Qianlong, after which things fell apart. If you don't have democratic succession processes, it's unclear how many good emperors in a row you can expect to have. The record in world history, as far as I know, is 5 in the Antonine dynasty of the Roman Empire in the 2nd century AD. That no other system of hereditary or semi-hereditary succession has ever managed to do that well. So, another reading question from last time. We've seen a bunch of economic growth since 1800 that puts China today in about the same position relative to the US in its living standards as it was back in 1800. How much richer is China now than it was back in 1800? At least according to Hans Rosling's numbers at gapminder.org. And we like to have seminars about whether those numbers are right or wrong, but for the purposes of this course, let's take them to be right. Yep, and we're homing in on the right answer, I think. About 20-fold for a country that does relatively well over the past 2 centuries. And over the past 5 years, China has graduated from a country that was doing okay to a country that's been doing relatively well in terms of its economic growth over the past 2 centuries. And you look at the extraordinary divergent world today, and I've telegraphed this before. My first reaction is to say just what the frack is going on here. That after all, we have a world of extraordinarily cheap international trade and communications. That we ship T-shirts from Shanghai to Oakland, and we can sell them in Oakland cheaper then we can sell American-made T-shirts in Oakland, even though we've included the cost of shipping the thing 7,000 miles across the ocean. In fact, we've already shipped it across the ocean. That the life cycle of a T-shirt, as Georgetown University economics professor Pietro Rivoli likes to say, is actually quite complicated. In the limit, a T-shirt starts as cotton in Texas, which is then freeze-dried and shipped by train to Long Beach, where it's then exported to a manufacturing center in Asia. Soon we won't be able to use Shanghai anymore. Soon it'll be someplace further south or someplace poorer. Soon it'll be India, I think. And then we ship the T-shirt from Shanghai to Jakarta to get dyed, and then from Jakarta to Miami Beach. And what happens when the T-shirt is given away to Goodwill? Does it stay in Philadelphia? No, it's shipped off to Africa, where it's sold in the used clothing market in Mombasa. And then the money goes back to Goodwill, and it uses it to pay the rent to keep the lights on. That over the course of its economic lifetime, a single T-shirt is going to travel 24,000 miles all the way around the world. And this is for something with an ugly picture of a parrot on it, which has a cheap retail value of $9.99. That in terms of our collective power to move stuff around the world, from wherever production is happening to wherever people are, is absolutely, totally awesome. Far exceeds what any previous century would have imagined. And yet the world today is this extraordinarily unequal beast that we see in this particular graph. And the question is why? Why has the world did so unequal back in 1975? And also, why are there signs that the world has become more equal since 1975? What is it that has led us to be more optimistic? Oh, sorry. Okay, we'll hide it. What is it that has made us more optimistic? Or what has gone right since 1975? Okay, I telegraphed the answer as E, and yet you want to pick up something else by and large. That's okay. Answer A, because expanded world trade has diminished international price differentials, is the answer you'll get in an economics course, especially in an international trade course. But actually, when you try to do the arithmetic, the fact that expanded world trade has made it possible to buy cheap things where they aren't made, that's a factor. It's not a huge factor. Right? For us, it means that we can buy French wines cheaply in California and Chilean grapes in December when the California grapes ain't growing. And it means we can buy cheap textiles in San Francisco, but most of the time in San Francisco we want to buy expensive textiles, which are still made largely in Los Angeles. A is a factor, but the expansion of world trade really hasn't done that much to make the world more equal in the last 25 years. Answer B, I kind of think about, is kind of the left-wing Democratic base answer, that outsourcing has reduced wage levels in the North Atlantic industrial core. And here again, it's there. It's very, very small. Say that outsourcing accounts for maybe 10% of the reduction in the speed of real wage growth in the North Atlantic industrial core over the past quarter century, and for virtually none of the drawing together of the world. Answers C and D are kind of development studies answers, and I think they're fairly wrong, right? That revolutions have ended colonialism, but the end of colonialism did not lead to any convergence in living standards across the globe, and we do indeed have a bunch of nationalist coups that have reduced neocolonialism. that practically every country is now able to strike its own deals with the multinationals that have invested in it and extract as much from them as the government wishes. But there's no sign that that ability to extract resources has filtered down to the average standard of living of the people. It has made a whole bunch of elites wealthy, but they then tend to move and live in Switzerland on the Riviera after they're overthrown. I think the right answer to this is E, that the world has become a lot more equal since 1975 because things have gone politically and economically more right than wrong in China and India, and that's kind of what you should focus on. Look rather than looking for some deep systemic determinants. And in some ways that's quite depressing because that tells us that we've largely been lucky over the past 25 years, 30 years, and that maybe the factors that tended to make the world become more unequal between 1800 and 2000 and 1975 are still at work. They've just been masked by a generation of good luck. So, to put that another way, there are always countries that are catching up to the world's productivity frontier and then are falling back. Right? That we have the United States from 1933 on up to 2009, steadily inventing new technologies and growing richer and richer. We have Argentina that kind of starts 1933 within hailing distance of the United States. Maybe an 8-year gap in life expectancy, maybe a 50% gap in average standards of living. Argentina's closed some of the gap in life expectancy since 1933. It's fallen way behind in relative economic growth. It's now about 3 times as far behind the United States as it was back in 1933. So there are always countries that are sliding down the relative income ladder, and there are always countries that are speeding up, that are catching up. In this case, Botswana, which we saw before, and that continue to catch up in spite of the AIDS epidemic. And this little blip here down in the recession of 2008-2009, well, that happens because Botswana's a big mineral exporter and was thus hit especially hard by the recession. It's kind of growing. There are always countries catching up and falling back, and you can't rely on any one story about one country doing one or the other to account for what's going on. So what has been going on over the past 2 centuries to make the world so much more unequal a place? Well, I think there are 4 factors, and they're factors making for savings. They're factors influencing savings and investment on the one hand, factors influencing population growth rates on the other, factors influencing technology transfer and organization, the efficiency of labor, and the third. But the most important factor making for a more unequal world, at least over the last 100 years, really has been communism. The fact that the middle of the 20th century saw a huge chunk of Eurasia fall under communist regimes did an extraordinary amount to widen the global distribution of income. And you can see this if you want to take a look at a bunch of different matched pairs of countries. Here we have China and what I'm told I'm supposed to call Taiwan, a province of China, because people get upset if it's implied that there is more than one, there might ever be more than one thing that we want to call China, more than one political unit that we want to call China. And back in 1945, they're kind of both pretty much at the same place. Indeed, if anything, China's a bit richer because it had been, or Taiwan, because it had been taxing Taiwan and not giving it much in services for, say, centuries before the Japanese conquest in 1895. And then Japan did some investment in Taiwan. Well, it ruled it for 50 years, but not a great deal. Come the end of World War II, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist Kuomintang loses the Chinese Civil War and promptly flees to Taiwan and gets ready to flee to Los Angeles But then the Korean War starts, and the U.S. 7th Fleet decides it's a good idea to sit in the Strait of Taiwan between China and Taiwan while the Korean War goes on. And after the Korean War is over, the fleet keeps sitting there, and the situation evolves that we have today. And yet between 1945 and 1978, you have the Kuomintang, which had been one of the least competent governments ever at spurring economic growth inside of China. While it ruled or half-ruled China between 1925 and 1945, turns out to be absolutely amazing at orchestrating economic growth in Taiwan. While the Maoist regime of Chairman Mao kind of plods along doing great things in terms of public health and life expectancy, except for the unfortunate mass famine at the end of the 1950s following the failure of the Great Leap Forward, but not really doing very much to boost the average standard of living inside of China. And you can see the same pattern if you want to compare matched pairs of countries, say, in South America. Cuba in 1958, when Fidel Castro takes over, is a relatively well-off country for Latin America. Brazil is quite poor. Cuba in 1995, when they began their process of letting the market economy come back in, looks to have been poorer than it was in 1958, albeit with a 10-year longer life expectancy than Cuba had since 1958. But then 10 extra years in life expectancy is about what you would expect. Being poorer in 1995 than you'd been in 1958 was absolutely not what you'd expect. Being poorer than Brazil in 1995 is definitely not what you'd expect. Then last we have Finland and Russia. Finland and Russia start out pretty much at the same place at the end of World War I in 1918, when Lenin takes over in Russia. And, you know, they both have fairly interesting times during the 1920s. And then starting in 1930, Joseph Stalin clamps the command economy onto Russia. And from then on, Russia grows. Russia grows a lot less than the Finnish economy does. And there are a bunch of interesting things that happen to Russia. For example, the life expectancy line disappears off the bottom. Whose fault is it that the Russian life expectancy line disappears off the bottom in this particular graph? And I do think this is a question that can be answered with reference to blaming one single human being, together with all the people who took their orders. You're not expected to know this now, you're just expected to be able to guess. Yeah. So, all right. Yeah. All right, and the right answer is D. Right? It's Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler does it. It's Adolf Hitler's fault. Right? That, I don't know whether it was the being taught wrong in his childhood or a general German fear of people from the East, or even reading too many cowboy books in his youth, and they're talking about how great it was that the American people were able to spread out and colonize and establish farms all over the Great Plains. But when Adolf Hitler and his Nazi army attacked the Soviet Union, attacked Russia in 1941, the explicit aim of the whole thing was, we're going to conquer this country, and then we're going to replace everyone living there with German farmers. Maybe we'll herd the surviving Russians onto reservations and admire their cats, maybe not. That, you know, the 6 million Jews killed by the Nazi regime were just the appetizer, were just supposed to be the appetizer. And so in 1942 and 1943, Russian life expectancy disappears off the bottom as the Nazi regime begins the start of what was, or what had they won the war, have been a real genocide. You know, and you know, it's kind of remarkable that, you know, Joseph Stalin is absolutely not the number one genocidal maniac of the 20th century, because he was a paranoid genocidal maniac, the general secretary of the Soviet Union from 1930 to his death in 1953. But it wasn't Stalin, and it wasn't any of the other guys. It was Adolf. So, now, why did the communists do what they did? Why does it seem to have been so very bad for economic growth? Well, I think to understand what they're doing, you have to start with Karl Marx, and with Karl Marx's old question of why don't workers receive the full value of what they produce? And if you look at any previous social formation to the one that we have, if you look back at the ancient world or at, say, imperial China or the Middle Ages, it's pretty clear why workers don't get to consume the full value of what they produce. It's because there are people on horses with spears who ride around and who say, give me a third of your crop, or work 2 days a week on my fields, or else. And so if you're a young person on the make, say in 12th century England, say you're William the Marshal, fourth son of a relatively low-class baron in the middle of England, and you want to rise and have a good and interesting life, what do? Well, you practice wearing your armor, you practice riding your horse, and you practice sticking things with your spear, and you turn into this strange and bizarre combination of warrior and professional athlete. No, seriously, that when there's a war on, you go and you fight for the king, and hopefully you get stuff and steal it. And when peace is on, you ride around England and France jousting in tournaments with the same lance that you normally use, except that you put its tip blunted so that when you hit someone in it, you just knock them off their horse and give them a concussion rather than killing them. William Marshall made a very good living as a professional athlete for about a decade and a half in the 12th century before signing up to fight for the armies of Henry II, Plantagenet, King of England, in his various wars against all of his kids, which were many. Come the end of Henry II's life, he is fleeing from the armies of his son Richard, who was going to become King Richard I, with virtually no one willing to defend Henry, because after all, it's clear he's about to die, and it's clear his son Richard will be the next king. So why defend the old king against the one who's going to be king, if not tomorrow, next year, or the year after that? Especially because if Richard catches up with Henry, it looks like he's mad enough to kill his father on the spot. So in any event, at a bridge, while Henry II is fleeing as fast as he can, William the Marshal catches Richard and riding in front of his army and kills his horse, says, I could have killed you, back off, and rides back to join Richard's father, Henry II. Henry II then dies. Everyone expects that Richard is then going to kill William the Marshal. Richard says, no, I'm not. You're the only loyal man in England, as far as I know. I'm going to marry you to the richest heiress the kingdom has. William Marshal becomes Earl of Pembroke. Later on, Lord Regent of England for Richard's kind of nephew when he inherits the crown. Lives extremely well. Doesn't make anything productive his entire life. It's not like he invented a new piece of software or invented a better way of making steel. But he claimed a good third of the produce of the earldom of Pembroke for himself and for his knights and his soldiers simply by virtue of being the guy up on top. Karl Marx said that in market economies it looks very much the same, that there are people who sit on the top and they claim a third of your stuff. But Marx said they don't do it by saying, I sit on a horse and have a spear and you don't, give me a third of your stuff or else. Instead, Karl Marx said, they do this by saying, well, gee, I want you to hire to work in my factory, but I can't afford to pay you the full amount of what you can make. I only can afford to pay you 2/3 of what you make. There's maintenance and capital costs and rent and interest and all these other things. And this Marx thought was wrong. That is, he thought that workers deserved the value of their labor, but that in a market economy, the market economy's equilibrium will only pay workers the value of their labor power. And hence, the right way to run a fair economy is to get rid of the market economy so that we can pay everybody fairly and replace the government of men by the administration of things. And Marx said the first thing you do in moving to a communist society is you've got to get rid of this private ownership of the means of production. Instead, everybody has to own the factories in some way. And the second thing you need to do is get rid of this kind of market exchange, because that's inevitably going to cheat the workers. And that's what Karl Marx said, and that's what the political movements that took power in his name believed, and that's what they tried. And it really, really did not work very well, especially in China, until Deng Xiaoping, who had been working for Mao Zedong since the 1920s, in fact, working relatively loyal for Mao since the 1920s, in spite of getting repeatedly arrested, purged, and imprisoned, having his children thrown out of third-story windows, and so forth. Until Deng Xiaoping emerged at the top of the heap after Mao's death in 1978 and said, what's really important about a cat is not whether it's red or white, not whether it's revolutionary or counter-revolutionary, but whether the cat catches mice. What's really important about an economic system is whether it promotes economic growth, and turn China away from Marxist orthodoxy onto its new course. But, China under Mao's not impressive. Cuba under Castro's not impressive, especially if you point out that Cuba was relatively wealthy by Cuban standards in 1989 because the Russians were giving it a huge amount of free oil, much of which it then sold in order to earn foreign exchange. The country that did the best, surprisingly, or somewhat surprisingly, is the homeland of world communism itself, Russia, which did see significant economic growth in the 3 generations of communist rule, in spite of the fact that it got invaded by the Nazis in the middle and lost maybe 24 million people in the course of that war. So that's the biggest single factor making the world more unequal today than it was back at the start of the 20th or even at the start of the 19th century. But that's not all of it. That even within market economies, we see enormous inequality. That communism is responsible for maybe a third of global inequality today, taking account of the difficulties of transition. But that still leaves 2/3 of the inequality across nations that we see. And those we trace to differences in population growth rates, differences in savings rates, and differences in the efficiency of labor. Population growth rate differences we talked about last time and the time before. Right? A higher rate of population growth gives you a lower capital intensity, gives you fewer machines per worker, holding everything else equal, and so makes your economy less productive. A lower savings investment rate. A lower savings investment rate gives you a lower capital intensity economy, and so makes you poorer. And I think let me stop there because we're out of time, and say let me finish up economic growth on Thursday and hopefully turn a little bit toward the depression economics unit of the class.